Every year I look for a story that calls me to tell it on Christmas Eve. And this year, an old story called Christmas Caroling by Jewel Johnson spoke to me and said, "Tell this to the people." So the story happened in the 1950s, in a cold climate where it was snowing outside. But people were safe and children wandered freely around. And so it was that just before Christmas one evening, there were 5 children from a Sunday school class who decided that they would go out caroling on their street. They lived on the edge of town. And so they went to all their neighbors and they sang the carols that they had practiced. And when they came to the end of their street, they said, "Where should we go now?" And they stood and looked. And really, the only house that they hadn't been to was what was thought of as the mansion that belonged to Mr. Blake, who owned the general store in town. He was the only millionaire that they knew. And everyone held him in awe. And at a little distance. And they looked and they saw that to get to his place would be about a half-mile walk. And he had a long lane that probably hadn't been plowed. They couldn't decide what to do because they could have gone home and watched a movie, or they could have just hung around town. But no, they wondered if they should go. And finally, the youngest, the little girl, she said, "He sometimes gives out chocolate bars." And it was true. On Saturday, when children went into the general store, Mr. Blake would give out free candy bars. Well, you can be sure that that kind of sealed the deal. And they decided that they would make the walk. And away they went. As they went, they talked about what they knew about Mr. Blake. It wasn't much that they knew personally, but they had heard their parents say quite a lot. He's grumpy and he's old. He thinks he's better than us. He doesn't come to church because he thinks if you have money, you should get a buy on all that kind of stuff. Finally, the little girl who understood about the chocolate bars, she said, "My father said he's deaf and he can't hear very well, and so he finds it hard to talk to people." Well, the kids were interested in that. By this time, they had almost arrived. So then they were faced with another problem. They said, "Look, there's hardly any lights on. What if he doesn't hear us?" Well, they sang first off, "O come all ye faithful." And there was no extra light that went on. So one of the older boys says, "Well, let's do Joy to the World. We can really give it to that one and make it loud." So they did. No extra lights turned on. So they turned to leave. And then the door opened, and a light did go on, and it was Mr. Blake's housekeeper, Mrs. Jennings. And she said, "Have you come to sing for Mr. Blake?" The children said, "Yes." She said, "Come in, come in." And so she ushered them into a room, and said, "Wait here." She went to get Mr. Blake. And he came out, and he said, looking surprised, he said, "You've come to sing for me?" They said, "Yes." He said, "What are your names?" And so they told him. He said, "All right." And he sat down, and because we know hearing aids weren't so good back in those days, he cupped his ears so that he could hear them. Well, they sang, "O Come All Ye Faithful" again, and then "Joy to the World," and then they ended with "Silent Night." Well, Mr. Blake, by the time they finished, was looking down at the floor, and he didn't stir. But when they looked at Mrs. Jennings, the housekeeper, she had a tear in her eye. The children didn't know what to do, and neither of the adults spoke. So they said, "Well, we best be going." And 4 of them turned, but the youngest little girl who knew about the chocolate bars, she just stood there, wide-eyed, looking at Mr. Blake, as if she was somehow mesmerized by him. Well, he finally rallied, and he said, "Wait here, don't leave. I have something for you." And he went out and he got his box of chocolates, and he said, "Here, have one. Merry Christmas." So the children each took a chocolate bar, and they wished him Merry Christmas. And they left. And when they got outside, well, it was a kind of strange thing. They stopped and said, "Let's eat our chocolate bars." And then the oldest boy said, "No, let's sing some more." And that was what they wanted to do, because they knew in their spirits that something amazing had happened. And so they sang joyously and went off home. I think the reason that that story wanted to be told this evening is because, you know, in the world that we live in, where there's so much agitation going on and so much separation amongst the human family, we've forgotten the tale, the pattern that we see in that story, that sometimes you have to travel quite a distance, and you have to overcome obstacles in order to really bring the joy and the hope and the peace and the love that Jesus came to bring. I like to think that what God did at Christmas was just like that. Traveled a great distance and overcame many obstacles to be born in that baby, to say to humankind, "My love is always with you. My love lives in this earth." Well, I don't know what happened to any of those kids, but I think they could be any one of us. Any one of us who bothers to travel a distance, who takes on obstacles and thrives against them in the name of love, in the name of bringing hope. Well, that's the story. Thank you for listening, and I hope it resonates in your heart. And whatever journeys there are for you to take, and whatever obstacles there are for you to face, I pray that the story of the Christ child being born on earth will empower you to prevail. Thanks for listening.